Welcome to the QSBI ESG Podcast. Today, we're joined by Ally, Data and Technology Leader at KPMG.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Ally. To start us off, could you briefly introduce yourself and share a snapshot of your journey across regulation, climate risk, analytics, IBM, and now KPMG?
Yeah, sounds good. So, hi everyone. My name is Ally Karmali. I'm a partner at KPMG in their advisory practice. I lead ESG for our banking sector as well as ESG data and technology services. I come from industry, so I, prior to joining KPMG, worked at IBM, where I led and founded the National Sustainability Consulting practice. It was a very forward, future-looking job where I got to apply exponential technologies to address climate change problems, particular decarbonization, reporting, and climate risk. Prior to joining IBM, I worked at a small startup called Resilience Economics. It was one of the first organizations that were quantifying climate risk for the purposes of supporting organizations with transferring that risk off their balance sheets. And I found that to be the entry point for me in climate risk. I did touch on climate risk when I was at the Prudential Regulator in Bermuda, which was a great experience for me. And I think some of that has found its way into some of the regulations that we're seeing today, particularly in Canada. And then prior to that, I was in industry within the banking sector with a stint in consulting. So I'm really excited to be here. Maybe just for a disclaimer, while I am here as a partner from KPMG, these are my views and not those of my firm. So I want to make sure that the disclaimer and anything that I say is a function of my understanding of the industry and not a perspective or a point of view from KPMG.
What an amazing journey. Before we dive in, today's episode explores something we hear constantly from students, founders, and industry teams alike. How do you actually move from ESG intentions to meaningful execution? Ally has worked across regulation, analytics, big tech, and consulting, making him the person to demystify that journey. I'll now be passing it on to Yangtze.
Thanks, Betty. So the first question we wanted to ask you is, based on your many years of experience in the industry, what would you say is the single biggest shift you've seen in how companies approach sustainability over the last decade?
So I would say the biggest shift that's happened is that sustainability has moved across being originally intended to be altruistic, a really strong intent to focus on reducing an organization's impact on the environment, but as well as understand its impact on them, to one of compliance, one that was driven primarily to ensure transparency of progress within organizations and the way that they share information publicly, to where I think we are now, which is sustainability as a function of strategy and value, really in terms of impact and return on investment. So I think what we are seeing is organizations now are using sustainability as a opportunity to inform capital allocation, to determine product strategy and growth decisions, not just disclosure. So rather than a shift, I feel like there's been a number of forces acting on sustainability to really push down aspects that might create this ultimate need for sustainability as a value creator. I think the first one has been the recent slowdown in the next wave of standards. And so organizations have an opportunity to really evaluate or reevaluate their IROs or their impacts, risks, and opportunities in the context of what really truly matters to stakeholders and investors. So there's been a shift from what do we need to disclose to what actually drives value, cost of capital, and then what drives the license to operate. So leading strategies really now talk explicitly about impact, return on impact, and return on transition capex. The other area is geopolitics and industrial strategy. I think all of that is happening very much against a very different geopolitical backdrop than 10 years ago, where I think the Paris moment really felt like a unified setting. Today, the net zero landscape is much more fragmented and geopolitical. And while holistically, I think the world is moving to a low carbon economy, not everyone is doing so at the same pace. So there are far more trade restrictions worldwide than there were in 2019, and there's real implications for clean tech supply chains or cross-border investment. And at the same time, sustainability has become a form of industrial strategy. So in Europe, through the Green Deal, the Net Zero Industry Act and the New Clean Industrial Deal. Climate policy is explicitly about industrial competitiveness and keeping innovation and jobs in Europe. And I would say the same for Canada, is climate competitive strategy. In the US, the Inflation Reduction Act was much more about manufacturing and jobs policy as it was about climate policy. But in China, which has, I think, positioned itself as a champion in EVs and batteries and solar, using clean tech as a way to enable its industry, its immobilization, and its own energy security. So layer on top of that, the shocks that we've seen in energy and food systems and sustainability is really now a security and resilience conversation about energy, food, and water, resilient supply chains, not just emission trajectories. We've seen energy shocks and food disruptions really mean that sustainability is now multiple things to multiple people. So if I try to sum all of that up in one sentence, over the last decade, sustainability has really shifted from how do we comply and tell our story to how do we compete, allocate capital, manage risk in a decarbonizing world, in a more fragmented world. And just as importantly, what is the impact on our business and on our communities? And then what is the corresponding financial return from doing that very well?
I think this shift towards a more strategic business lens rather than just a compliance standpoint is something that many of us have observed. In your 2024 article, Unlocking ESG Value with Climate Tech, you describe many firms, especially private equity, as still being in the discovery phase of ESG data readiness. What would you say is the real barrier holding companies back from progressing towards full digital integration?
Yeah, when we talk about firms still being in the discovery phase on ESG and climate tech, people often assume that the barrier is technology, but I don't think it's the case. It's not that they just haven't picked the right platform yet or that they're waiting for regulation to settle. All those things matter. I think what's happened is that there's been maybe 3 barriers that have prevented them from moving forward. Maybe a few years ago, the big gap was around aligned purpose. Why are we doing ESG? How does it connect to our products and our business and our services? Most leadership teams that I speak with now see ESG or sustainability as strategically important. And many see it as a revenue and resilience play rather than just a cost. So the challenge has shifted. It's about translation and integration, taking that intent and really hardwiring it into data, systems, and processes and people, culture, really within the day-to-day decisions. So I think there's 3 barriers. I think the first one is that sustainability data is largely built for reporting, not for running a business. It sits in spreadsheets or standalone tools. It's owned by a small central team. It doesn't consistently show up in investment committee papers, portfolio reviews, or planning or pricing. The second barrier is the data foundation. I think a lot of organizations are sitting on a large volume of sustainability data, but they're not financial grade. The definitions aren't consistent, audit trails are weak, and collection is very manual. So that makes it hard to really plug in ESG into really core finance, sustainability, risk planning systems with any kind of confidence. And the third barrier, which I think is probably the most important one, is that there's a gap in ownership and capability. And while ESG data really cuts across operations like HR, finance, legal, risk, and IT, as well as the business, it easily becomes everybody's problem and nobody's job. And at the same time, skills and capabilities for non-financial data, controls and assurance are still catching up. So the firms that really move beyond the discovery phase flip the sequence. They're starting with agreeing on which decisions they want ESG data to influence, perhaps through a materiality assessment. They then define the minimum data set and standards, they assign clear ownership, and only then choose to integrate technology. So when you do it in that order, you really get full digital integration and it starts to stick, partly because the culture allows for organizations to follow through. The buy-in is there, the reason or the why is there. The how and the what start to form around operating model decisions and the technology and the processes that are going to be used.
To piggyback a little bit on that, when companies try to integrate sustainability data into core business processes, where do cultural or organizational barriers tend to arise? How can leaders overcome them?
That's a good question. I think most transformations that are large fail. They fail because of low engagement and insufficient investment in capabilities in change management, not because the technology didn't work. I think cultural and change management is massively underestimated. There's a lot of data that backs that up. The KPMG ESG Assurance Maturity Index that we produce shows that while a large majority of companies now have or soon will have ESG reporting obligations, only 29% feel that they have policies, skills, and systems to really be ready for that independent ESG assurance. And only a third say that they have a clear audit trail for their non-financial information. So skills and resources are the single most frequently cited challenge across beginners and leaders alike. And this tells you that this is as much about people and operating models as it is a technical one. We know that ESG data is quite disparate across a number of functions across an organization, and it changes. So one way I think organizations that think about the challenges can make progress is really treat ESG data as a change program first and a tech program second. They invest in what is maybe a clear narrative about why it matters in business terms. They redesign the processes so data is captured and embedded rather than a bolt-on. And then they build local champions and skills in the portfolio and the business, not just the sustainability team.
So, kind of summarizing those key insights and also your real world observations together, when you look at organizations that are genuinely reducing emissions, what patterns or mindsets stand out to you about how they approach technology and digital tools?
I think organizations that think about the ultimate benefit to decarbonization usually find a way to track that back into the business. They look at what value is received from allocating capital to a decision. They start with a very clear business language value story that links sustainability metrics to revenue margin risk, cost of capital. They clarify governance and decision rights for ESG data systems with really shared ownership between these various functions like finance and the business, sustainability. They embed metrics into processes like, for example, deal memos or portfolio reviews or underwriting decisions or procurement scorecards. And they invest in data literacy. And all of these elements are factors into which project or decarbonization solution ends up being the most impactful for the organization and the organization's targets. So really claiming the benefit of moving towards a low carbon economy has to come with some underlying financial benefit. Some of the times, organizations will spend the time and the money to focus on meeting their claims, their public claims, which I think is one side of the story. Other organizations that have the opportunity to decide where they are going to decarbonize and when that will be to a certain point where they feel it's feasible can actually take time to figure out what's the right lever, what's the data that's going to allow them to govern that commitment over time, and then what is the underlying benefit. So for some organizations that are in the real estate business, benefit is actually lower fixed costs. For other organizations that are in, for example, mining, will realize that applying significant upfront cost of capital into renewable energy systems will actually create long-term benefits and efficiencies down the line, increasing margins in a certain time period. And maybe quite ironically is that the significant amount of power consumption for hyperscalers can only point to renewable energy sources in the short term to support the kind of energy capacity required to power them. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities to decarbonize, and organizations that find the underlying ROI as well as the return on impact will essentially win because it brings the clear business language value story to the front and across the organization.
So, Ally, I know you talked a lot about long-term and short-term goals for ROI and return on impact, which I really like the terminology of, return on impact and not just investment. I was curious, bringing back to your article about data and technology and unlocking ESG. When it comes to the actual data part, you emphasize that data is the ultimate proof of certification and progress. Where do you typically see organizations struggle? Is it in collecting the right data, transforming it, or is it putting that actually into decision making?
When we wrote that the data is ultimate proof of certification and progress, we mean that your credibility on ESG comes down to whether you can trace the numbers back to real activity. And in practice, organizations tend to struggle at 3 points in that chain. I think the first one is collecting the right data and making sure it's reliable. In our ESG assurance work, only a minority of companies say they have a clear audit trail for their non-financial information, and many still rely heavily on spreadsheets and manual collection. But it remains a challenge to get consistently high quality data from subsidiaries, portfolio companies, and suppliers, particularly when you move into scope 3. The second struggle is that the transformation and control layer, really harmonizing definitions, applying the right standards, building checks and controls so that the data will stand up to independent assurance. That's quite important. And that's really where most of the hidden costs and delays appear, because it involves all these functions within an organization working together. And the third, and often most underdeveloped, is using the data in decision making. And we really see a lot of organizations still in this sort of basic data collection mode. And none really have yet significantly progressed to full integration of data or leading with ESG insights. So even when the data exists, it's not always being fed into the right sort of decision frameworks in order to make very business-oriented decisions. So if I had to prioritize, I'd say data collection and quality is where organizations feel the pain first, but data decision-making underpinned by good data is where they leave most of that value on the table. And that's not our clients. I think that's just generally organizations in sustainability. We have to kind of balance that with what the use cases are. And so there's a number of opportunities and priorities that organizations are facing, especially in today's geopolitical landscape. So the question is where do we put the time, the effort, the money, where it suits us the most and where it solves the most related and important use case. For organizations that see transparency and accountability to their customers and stakeholders and suppliers, they focus on reporting, not only because it's a compliance-driven exercise, but because it's an important exercise in its entirety. And the second part of that is, can you find value in what you're doing today? And can you extract that value such that you can demonstrate that there's actual competitive advantages to driving sustainability through your products, through your services, through your business strategy? And can you align business strategy and product strategy and your sustainability strategy together? I find that those often end up being where most organizations can really put the best use of sustainability into decision making, and through those three sort of struggles, really get to that point.
So, Ally, within those three key challenges that you just talked about, where would you say has the biggest opportunity space for leaders to take advantage of when trying to align their ESG strategy with their business strategy?
I'd say maybe start with figuring out what data do I have currently available to me? And based on that data, are there any gaps? Is it through either a gap assessment or some form of connection to your materiality assessment outcomes that you're able to define or determine that I actually have the right data? The data has a certain level of quality to it. There is a gap or two that needs to be addressed, or the data needs to be augmented, and that it satisfies the requirements that are being asked of the organization, whether it's through reporting or through some form of KPIs decided by the organization for the purposes of making decisions or monitoring progress. I think the second thing is really build into the culture that you have. Every firm has a culture. It's on a spectrum of, on one side being one where you are disassociated, because there's a lot of variation between you and your firm's culture, and one that you are highly integrated, you and your firm's culture. And for everybody, it's important to align that this is not something that we're doing to create extra work, but that this is something rooted in the why we do what we do in the first place. If an organization is intending to provide transparent data to its customers for the purposes of ensuring that there is accountability in what they are doing, then every person who finds that they have a role in playing into that process and who has already been doing so in the financial context would probably align to the fact that they want to be part of something that's bigger and greater than what they're doing. In that same vein, leaders have to look at and really understand whether we're asking significant amounts of work over and beyond what is possible. In that case, can we find opportunities for productivity upliftment? AI has created an opportunity to reduce that burden of reporting. And I think we're starting to figure out that having a strong data set that is rooted in almost hands-off management, where you're picking up data from the source, you are transforming data using source data, you are aligning data and standardizing it according to common taxonomies and templates and tables that are allowed for multi-use or multilateral use cases. And then you're allowing yourself the ability to use various AI enablers or agents to create specific use cases that I think will serve the organization more. And I think that's just another function of being embedded within your culture.
I really like how you tie in the positive association of using AI to reduce work with also a cultural shift in an organization. Now, shifting over a little bit to questions about advice for students like us and early professionals that are passionate about ESG. Where do you see the most promising career path emerging, especially at the intersection of data, technology, and impact?
If I could restart my career at this point in time, I would be thinking about where are the intersections of the economy that are now moving at such speed that we have the ability to start to think new and to innovate. And so I would say that there's large macro factors. There's the energy transition, there's water security, new and emerging area of focus, there's adaptation and transition finance, there's new ways of clean tech and climate innovation and development, there's opportunities for consulting around strategic value creation that is very much a function of understanding how business and sustainability intersect, and then how can we start pulling on levers where there is actual key metrics and KPIs to do that. I would be very excited to focus in things that I think are driving us forward. So AI is surely a big piece of that. And there is an opportunity to think about the energy that AI consumes much more efficiently. There's opportunities to think about how can we use the various sustainability frameworks that are out there and guidelines to be able to look at where within those frameworks are there opportunities to move from disclosure to business decisions, and what is that language look like for organizations who want to be more strategic or financially focused. So there's a lot of areas to play. I would certainly encourage anybody who's looking to get into sustainability to continue to understand the language of sustainability, be experts in the standards, the regulations, the guidelines. I think those are important when it comes to where organizations are and are going. It's a unified protocol for everyone to have a common basis for discussion and for consumption of data. The second thing I think is important is making sure that you are coming into an organization with a creative, innovative mindset about how you think sustainability will look like and play a role in the organization's future. Everyone is moving toward the data and tech angle of ESG reporting, but then the next wave of that is what do we do with this data? How do we change our products and services to align? And it won't be driven on the basis of sustainability products. It'll be products and services with a sustainability background to it. I think that there is a role for startups in sustainability to continue to drive new product and services in terms of innovative climate related technology. I think we are moving to Canada has a climate competitive strategy, and that it means ensuring that Canada has the ability to export its products and services to economies and jurisdictions that will buy Canadian products and services. Why? Because it is not only a quality product, but the price of that product and its climate impact are also quite aligned in the market. So I think there's an opportunity to start thinking about what role are you going to play in the Canadian export economy, and how can you use Canada's underpinning resources and technology background to do that. And then lastly, sustainability consulting is not going away with AI, as most people think. There's a huge opportunity to continue to come into the sustainability world and innovate. And this is really much a place for creative thinking and for determining how we can help organizations that have very topical problems and ones that aren't easily solved by AI. And I think there's a big reason for humans to be a part of that, because some of the problems are centered around humans. They're human-centered problems. We need human-centered solutions, and it requires us to think that way.
I'm really happy to hear the optimism in your answer when it comes to the involvement of humans instead of AI for human-centered problems. I also like to think of this podcast, the QSBI podcast, as an opportunity for students to keep up to date with the language of sustainability, like you mentioned. I was also curious on your own personal journey, if there was ever a specific moment in your career that sparked your own commitment to environmental and social impact.
There's been a number of small sort of moments in my time where I've realized the importance of sustainability. And I always understood it from the environmental side before I really became so entrenched that now I kind of see it from multiple angles, but maybe two areas. So I think the first one is I really love the idea of preserving what we have for the future. I think we're all naturally hoping to survive on this planet, and I don't think any of us wants to damage it, but technology can provide its benefits and it creates challenges. So when I was in Bermuda, I was working for the regulator there, and I just remember sitting on a beach, and as I was looking at the water, I realized this is a moment that I think everyone deserves to look out at the planet once in a while and just admire our planet in such a way that makes me want to fight for it. The second opportunity that sort of reignited my passion for sustainability is there are so many people that I think are impacted by climate change, and I think they're impacted in a way that is asymmetric. I'll give you an example. There are groups of people who are currently in, I would call the margins of climate change impact. They are either in high drought situations and which are exacerbated by severe weather, and then there are others who are in significant flooding events where their whole life is being disrupted. And there are others who have been protecting the planet for a long time. They've been doing so because it's so culturally ingrained, and they get disenfranchised from the resources that others exploit for the purposes of profit. So I think the idea of sustainability is really about ensuring that there is a common understanding of who is disenfranchised and then who can be part of the solution so that there is more equity and more involvement and consideration for those that are going to experience that risk in the near term.
I think it's such an important yet rarely talked about discussion that the effects of climate change do not impact everyone the same way. And it's so important to understand that there is an equity factor in this discussion. Before we wrap things up, if listeners were to just take one thing away from today's conversation, what should it be?
Maybe two thoughts. One is the data and tech angle of this podcast means that we are moving towards, or holistically, the industry is leveraging data and technology for the purposes of improving the kind of disclosures that it's putting out. And I think in doing so, there isn't enough importance being placed on how to treat data as close to financial data as possible. So how do we create opportunities to take a very unstructured set of data, which is real to world, and connect it to financial statements or in a pro forma standpoint to really make or hit home the impact that this is having. I'll give you an example. Water, we all consume it. Every organization depends on it. Without water, a significant amount of the organizations that operate in today's economy would cease. The fact that water isn't the most material supplier on a risk registry is a problem. It should be. It should be treated like a significant supplier of product and services. Water is a crucial component. So we need to think about the data that we're collecting. We need to think about the outputs in which that data is serving better decisions. And we need to think about sustainability in the context of both an impact and an ROI. And I think the second thing to do is from a career standpoint, sustainability will ebb and flow. It will be influenced and pushed and pulled on the basis of geopolitical tensions, economic cycles. But I wholeheartedly believe that sustainability as a term will be embedded in such a way that you are going to be thinking or working in industries where sustainability is actually a strength. It's a superpower. It allows organizations to ensure that they're doing two things, not just one. And they'll need skills from the people who are going through this journey in their lives. So continue to focus in on what sustainability is, where it's going, and try to be creative in the process, because that's going to allow us to change and challenge ourselves with the problems that are being presented to us.
Thank you so much, Ally, for taking the time with us today and enrich our listeners. We loved hearing from you, and we're excited to stay updated on the incredible things you'll continue to accomplish in the field of ESG, technology, and finance. Thank you to everyone for listening, and stay tuned more for next time.
Thanks for having me.